Having prepared a text block with laced-on boards and hollow back, today we will cover this book in full leather. We'll start by making a template for the covering leather. Now I'll put a border around the edge of this piece of paper, and that will be the frame, the outside frame. And then I will mark a 15mm turn-in. Then I'll put that on the book to determine the other edges of the piece of leather. Again, 15mm turn-in. I'll assume that it's a symmetric piece of leather. I'll cut that shape out, and then I'll use that to choose the piece of leather from the hide that I'm going to use. Now this is quite a beautiful piece of kangaroo leather, though it is a bit on the thick side and not very flexible. It's quite stiff. I forgot to mark the center of the template, so I'm just doing that now because I'll use that to help line this template up on the spine of the animal. You can see the spine as the dark line running down the animal. I've got the head towards me and its big legs at the top. So it's looking like I'll get 2 books out of this skin, which is good. There's one of my last pieces of high quality kangaroo, so I'm pleased about that. So I'll just cut that out now. Some people use scissors for cutting leather. I prefer to use a knife. I think it's much of a muchness. I think it's whatever you're taught initially is what your preference is. To help me with the pairing of the leather, I'm going to mark the edges of the book with a China pencil. I'll also mark where the joints are, because I will pair the joints a little bit. This leather is fairly thick, it's about 1mm, and it does need to be thinned a little bit at the joints. In general, I try and thin the joints as little as possible. However, if you are going for the fine binding look, then you will want to thin the joints a bit more. If you don't have a China pencil, then tailor's chalk is also good for marking up the leather. I'm going to start by edge pairing the leather, and then I'll use my spoke shave to thin the turn-ins, and then I'll also thin the joints, and then finally I'll thin the head cap area. This leather's obviously been rolled up an awfully long time. It has dried out a lot as well. If I'd thought about it, I would have put a little bit of moisture into it at least the day before and put some weight on it to flatten it out. It would have made pairing a lot easier. Now that I've gone around the outside, it's time to swap to the spoke shave. I'll need both hands to use the spoke shave, so I'll use a clamp to hold the leather in place. I'm not taking the leather to a feather edge on the outside. I know a lot of people always take the leather to a feather edge, so that's essentially you're cutting down to nothing so that you've cut into the grain side of the leather. I will pare into the leather about a half an inch or a bit further past the edge of the turn-in or the edge of the book. So at the edge of the book, the leather is probably about 0.5 of a millimetre thick. I will bend the leather up until it feels flexible enough that it will go easily around the edge of the book. Because of those 19th century bindings with the extremely thin leather that's just not held up to time, my preference is to not over thin leather. Now I am going to thin the leather a little bit at the joints. Now to thin the leather at the joints, I do need to take some material off the spine area as well. Otherwise, once I've gone down the joint once or twice with the spoke shave, then the sides will hold the blade off the leather and I won't get any deeper. So I will take a little bit extra off the spine, and if I did have raised bands, I'd probably have to take some more material off the spine anyway so that it molds around the raised bands easily, especially with this quite stiff leather. I've remarked the joint positions because that's going to be useful for positioning the book later. I'll also, for pairing the head caps, I will do some extra pairing at the head caps so that there's no bulk in the leather at the turn-in. And I just need to know the width of the spine area for that. The last thing I'll do is give the head cap area some attention. Now I will take the leather in this area down to a feather edge because I don't want a line at the edge of the turnover on the spine. So I do want to thin that, and I'll fold that over and make sure that I can't feel it through the leather. Now it's time to apply the leather to the book, and as usual I'll start by wetting out the grain side of the leather, which stops tide marks from the paste coming through the leather, and it softens the leather and it stops it drying out too fast. I'd already noticed that this leather was quite dry, but wetting it out and applying this paste, I realised that it's extremely dry, unusually dry. Now I'm going to do something slightly different on this book. I've just finished the book by Tremmel Wilcox about her career in bookbinding. It's called Degree of Mastery, and specifically she talks about her apprenticeship a lot. And last month I also watched the video by Mark Esser on covering a book in leather. Now Esser and Wilcox have something in common. They both apprenticed with Bill Anthony. Bill Anthony is a legendary bookbinder, and he must have taught that after pasting up the leather before applying another coat of paste, that you should scrape off the previous coat of paste. Now, I'd read this before, I don't remember where, and I've often wondered why you would do this and wondered whether there is a good reason for doing it. It has crossed my mind it might be one of these things that goes back to wheat paste days when the proteins are still in the paste. I'm just getting things ready here, so I'm just getting my favourite pointy bone folder and a piece of cord together for doing the head caps. Anyway, back to this story. So Bill Anthony must have taught his apprentices to scrape off the paste. And when I pulled this piece of leather apart again, and I think it's to do with how dry the leather was, the paste had gone quite unusual, and I decided to give this a go of scraping the previous layer of paste off. So the way Annie described it was to put a bit more paste on, scrape it off, and then repaste again. And the idea was to get fresh paste into the leather. And having done this for this book, I'm not sure that I noticed any difference in the final result. But there was something a little bit satisfying about scraping off the paste, and I may continue to do it into the future. And if it was good enough for Bill Anthony, then it's certainly good enough for me. Something I picked up from the Mark Esser video was to put this layer of paste on the boards of the book and the spine before applying the leather. And I've done this a couple of times now, and I quite like this. I think the leather stuck better, but because I've only done it a few times now, I did sort of forget to do the other side and have to go back and do it later. So I'm just going to put a couple of marks in the paste, just lightly in the paste, so that helps me position the book. I want to get it as close to the correct position as possible so I don't have to reposition it much. And they'll just make life easier in the long run. And then once I've got it in position, now I should put a layer of paste on that other board, but I forget. And now wrap the leather around, but don't try and stretch it too hard around the spine. You just want it firmly on the spine. Now I'm quickly going to turn the book up on its foredge. I'll peel the leather back so that it doesn't peel underneath the boards. I'm just very gently and evenly pulling the leather down over the spine without stretching it. It's only moving down a fraction of a millimeter, maybe a half a millimeter at most, just to make sure that it's there's no gaps around the spine. I don't want to stretch the leather. Now I can trim the corners in the usual way, which I've done in a number of videos now. I push the leather down onto the corner so I get an impression, a mark where the corner is. Here's when I realized I'd forgotten to put that extra layer of paste on, so I'm going to go back and do it now. So I'm going to peel that leather back, and then use my paring knife. I'm going to cut that off at a steep angle, 1.5 board thicknesses away from the corner. So I'll do the turn-ins at the head and the tail first. I'll refresh up the paste on the turn-ins because they'll started to dry out a little bit. And I'll start by turning the leather in at the hollow spine into the tube. And then I'll work more. Once I get that leather into that tube, then I'll turn in either side, and then I'll get the bone folder and work the leather into the tube nice and evenly and smooth it down. Now, of course, the beauty of working with paste and leather is that you don't need to panic. If something's not going well, the craft paper I use for the tube isn't great in that when it gets wet, it gets a bit soft and it can fold up on itself. And so when I'm checking the head cap, if I notice that it happened, I can just pull the leather back out, fix that tube, and then put it back in. As long as I keep everything moist, then there's no need to panic or rush. You can just take your time and get things pretty much the way you like them. If there's something not quite going right, you can undo it and then start again. And that's where using PVA is a bit of a fraught experience. You've pretty much got one shot, and if it doesn't end up the way you want it, then you've really got yourself into a bit of a pickle, especially in the turn-in down the tube. Something I should have mentioned earlier is that at this point you always want to keep the book on something soft because the leather is extremely delicate at this point. It's easily marked up. You want to take off any jewelry, any rings, watch. I don't wear any of these things, so I don't really think about it that much. But you don't want to mark the leather. Also, you want a couple of pressing boards that you can open the book up as I am here and keep that cover the board flat. Now I'm just doing the pleated corners. It's really hard to see with this dark leather, but I'm just pleating the leather and then forming it into a slight round. I'm putting in the joint spacer and a moisture barrier with a piece of polyester film. Having done the close-up, the camera works let me down. Now I'm going to do an operation called setting the joint, which is really important to the future good opening of the book. I'm going to push that board forward so that the board lines up level with the shoulder of the book. Now you need to give it a fair bit of pressure, and you probably should go a little bit further than I did here. I couldn't really see it from my angle because it was hidden by the piece of timber. Some people, I think, use backing boards, and so the shoulder can you can go past over the shoulder. But I normally just sight it and make sure that the board and the edge of the board ends up lining up with the shoulder. Now I'm going to set the head caps. So I'm going to start by going around each of the corners with a piece of cord and impressing the top of the joints. Now when I do that, I do pull slightly towards the center of the book. Once I've done that, then I'll wrap the cord around the spine of the book with the cord in those grooves. And then I'll pull it somewhat tight. I won't pull it super tight, but quite firm, enough to hold those impressions into the joint. There's another fairly common way to form the head caps where you wrap the cord around your fingers and pull it down over the top of the book, but I've never used that technique, so I'm not going to try and demonstrate it. Now is when your pointy bone folder comes in handy. So start by pulling the leather outwards against that cord and then tap the head cap down to form a little bonnet over the end bands. So I think the ideal result is that you can still slightly see the end bands when you look directly down from the top. You don't want to completely cover the end bands. Well, that's, I guess, my preference and my understanding of what a good head cap looks like. Now, if you don't have enough leather for the head cap, you can just use your thumb to push a tiny bit of leather up the spine on the outside. I did try and demonstrate that. I must have missed it a moment ago. But it is why one of my head caps ends up a bit thicker than the other. Now for some reason, maybe it's just my skill level, but you'll never get the two head caps to look identical. In this case, I end up with one that covers the end bands just a little bit too much and is a little bit thicker. And that's because I was trying to demonstrate pulling a bit of leather up. Well, that's my excuse anyway. Now I've left the book dry overnight, so I'll take the cord off the spine and then I'll open the boards up for the first time since covering. Now you have to be careful the first time you open it. The inside of the turn-ins is a little bit fragile, so until they get used to opening, you want to put a little bit of moisture on them as you open them up this first time. Once that they've been softened, the paste inside the leather has been exercised a bit, then it's not an issue. It's just this first time. Now, as I've been saying, this leather was very dry, and remember all the water I've been putting into it. It's resulted in this leather pulling really hard, and I've got a bit of a problem. The boards have pulled out significantly, more than I expected and more than I've accounted for by lining the inside of the boards. So I don't think the fill-in material and the paste down is going to pull these boards flat, so I have to do something about it. So I'm going to start by just trimming up the turn-ins so that they're straight. Some people will go around and trim up the turn-ins so that they're even all the way around. I tend to just straighten up each edge, and I've been pretty lucky in that the other board is almost perfect. It's probably something to do with how stiff this leather is, but I do straighten up the edges, otherwise it's a bit hard to do the fill-in. Now once I've done that, I'm going to try and pull these boards back in with an extra layer of bank paper. So I'm going to see if I can balance out this pull. So I've got this very thin bank paper, and I'm going to paste it out and let it relax for a while, and let the moisture soak in and let the paper expand as much as possible, so I get the maximum pull possible to get rid of this warp that I've developed in the boards. Of course, there's a lot worse things can happen in life. I could have a board that's over-warped inwards, because in that case there's nothing I can do about it. I can't paste something on the outside to pull the boards out. So you can slip the lining paper and try and relax the boards on the inside to get the boards to go out, but that's more difficult than putting an extra lining on the inside. So I'm going to do one on each board to start with and see how that goes. So I'm going to prop this open a little bit to help with the drying, and then leave it overnight and see how it goes. So the next day, straight away, it's looking a lot better. There is still a slight outwards warp, but I think the fill-in material and the paste down will take care of that nicely. And talking of filling in, that's the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to use my 0.3mm manila card. Because I didn't edge pair this leather down to a feather edge, and the couple of spots where I did trim it up, I only trimmed up a little bit, then there is a little bit of thickness at the edge of the leather, and that matches this card pretty close. So I'm just going to cut that pretty much to the exact size. The manila card won't stretch much, and I'm going to use PVA to put it down as well. So I've added, I've taken off about 0.5 millimeter to allow for stretch. Not much. Now I'm going to do each side separately. So after I put this infill material down, then I'm going to paste in. So I'm going to put down the paste down. So to do that, of course, I've got to remove the cap on this side, so I'll get rid of that. And the first thing I'm going to do after that is to remove the waste paper. Now, I've been asked so many times about waste papers, so finally I'm going to demonstrate ripping out the waste paper, which is simply a matter of supporting the text block at the corner and then pulling straight up carefully, and the waste paper will tear along the spine. If there's any paper left over, just pull it off. I've got a pair of tweezers that I use for that. If there's any roughness, you can get a fine piece of sandpaper. Now I'm going to work that end paper down over that edge so that it's easy to get it into position when I paste it down. A significant difference with this book to all the other projects I've done is that I'm going to put down the end paper, the paste down, with the book open. So I'm going to paste out, use paste on the paste down because I want the paste down to stretch. And then I'm going to put PVA at the spine section because it does have a tendency to pop up. So using an adhesive that tacks a little bit better is useful there. I'm going to let the paste down relax or stretch as much as possible, because otherwise I'd be a little bit short at the foredge, but the stretch will save me. Now I'm going to put this down carefully. I'm going to start by lifting the end paper and then using my finger to go along and then push it up against that edge, and then I'll start to bring it over that corner. So I'll use my thumb and finger to make sure that there's no hollow under the paper, and then I'll finally bring it down across the board. Now I'm going to let this dry a couple of hours at least, but I don't want it completely dry. I want a little bit of moisture because everything needs to settle into its final position. There's a little bit of stretching and carrying on that goes on here. Now there's this technique for closing the book at this point where you want to keep an eye on the inside of that joint. You can see that it's started to pop up a little bit, but not too much, so I'm okay there. And to be able to keep an eye on it, you need to bring the book up towards the board and the board up towards the book. And once you get it closed, then you're okay. There's still a lot of moisture in this book, so once it dries out, it'll start to close better. Now I'll do the other side exactly the same. Now I'm going to put a blotter and then a moisture barrier at each end of the book, and I'll wrap it in my piece of foam and then let the book dry for a while under a bit of light weight. I'll probably leave it a day or two like this, changing the blotters a few times. The book will continue to dry for many days, if not weeks, but at this point we're pretty much done, so we'll go through the process of opening a new book again at this point. And now we can see that it opens nicely. It opens fairly flat. The book throws up nicely so that the pages don't have to drape too much. And the boards are ever so slightly warped inwards, which is just the way we want it. Maybe in a different climate, different humidity, they'll straighten out a bit, but I shouldn't have to worry about them warping open. For the purpose of this video, I'd put down the end paper early. Normally putting down the end paper will be pretty much the last thing you would do. You'd normally do the finishing first. And one of the last things I'd also do is apply a leather dressing wax like this Hewitt's one that I like to use, which would take this dull leather to a really nice shiny leather. Now, of course, I'll want to do that on the inside turn-ins, but I don't want to get it on the paste down paper. So I would do that. It would go on the leather that goes under the paste down, and then I'd paste down the end paper. But I'm going to keep this book for a future video. I'll do some sort of finishing on it. So I'm just going to leave it like this for now. So that's the end of the video. That's the end of the project. I hope you've enjoyed the full leather binding. It's been a bit of an epic on my end, and I'm probably going to take it a bit easier for a few weeks with either simpler videos, or I might even take a couple of weeks off. As always, I really appreciate it if you did enjoy the video, if you hit the big thumbs up button, and if you want to be notified of my future videos, even if they're simpler technique ones, or if I do take a break and then come back to bigger projects, then please hit the subscribe button. Just a quick look at something I bought the other day was this huge ledger, which I'm quite pleased with. So until next time, cheerio.